Hello, children. It's Pastor Matt here for our Children's Praise lesson. I want to talk to you about the gospel today. And I know you've heard that word before around the church. You've probably heard it once or twice. And I know in these videos we've talked about it. But if we could talk about it one more time from a different perspective, that way you can understand what the word gospel means. I want you to try to remember the word gospel. Let's all put our hands together and think of the big word imaginary appearing right in front of your eyes. Gospel, right? The gospel of Jesus Christ. So the gospel means good news. When we say we are going to talk about the gospel of Jesus, we're going to talk about the good news of Jesus. So we don't have newspapers much these days. A lot of people don't read them like they used to, but the church we do have a newspaper. It's called the New Life News. This is actually our premier first edition. It actually says issue 1 of volume 1. This was on March of 2021. This is history. This was history in the making only a little over a year ago. And it should be laminated and codified for the history books. But you see here, the New Life News, this is a newsletter. Your mom or dad will probably get this emailed to them typically once a month. And you could take it and print it up like this and actually have a real piece of paper. But this is what we call a newspaper. And when you open up a newspaper like this one has to do with New Life. So this is all the news that happens in the church. And when we first started the newspaper, there wasn't a lot going on because we were in the middle of this little thing called a pandemic. And there wasn't a lot of stuff to talk about. But you see, if we're going to talk about the news, we're going to talk about a note from the pastor, women's ministry. Back then we were still doing the baby bottle campaign. We're talking about the calendar, all these things. So you flip over and there's like a little piece of news from me as the pastor. And we flip over again and it says a little bit about the women's ministry that day or that month. And Rooted Outreach is a ministry we do to help women and families who have been in traumatic situations. So this is cool because then it gives you a calendar at the end to say, here's what we're going to do as a church for this month. This is some of the things that are happening on the calendar. And so this is relaying information. This is giving people news. It's a newspaper. Well, that is what the gospel's like, right? So this is what it says in Romans. We've done this verse before. I want you to understand it again. This is Romans 1:16. It says, for I am not ashamed, Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So we're just going to focus in on that very beginning. I'm not ashamed of the gospel because of the power of God unto salvation. So Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the news. I'm not ashamed of God's newspaper. See, this is our church newspaper, but God has a newspaper, and it's called the gospel. And he wants the gospel to go out into all the world like this. Like you go out and talk about the gospel to someone, and you say, did you hear the good news that Jesus died and rose again? And then someone says, why is that good news? Or why does that matter? Well, because Jesus was God's own son, and he died in place of all your sin, so that you don't die, and he rose so that you would rise to life. That's really good news because we have that problem in all of our world. That's the simple gospel. And we should never be, Paul says, we should never be ashamed of it, because by hearing that news and understanding it and really believing it, that's God's power in this world for salvation. That's the newspaper that we give out, the gospel of Jesus Christ. So when you talk to your teachers today, I want you to be able to answer the question, what is the gospel? What does the word gospel mean? And what exactly is the gospel of Jesus, the good news of Jesus? So gospel means good news, and the gospel of Jesus is the story of Jesus' life, his birth, his life, his death on the cross, his moment in the grave, his resurrection, and his ascension to heaven. That whole process, his whole life, is the good news, the news about Jesus' life that was not just an individual story, but has important things for you and me to know about. Everyone needs to know about this news. So I want you to talk about that with your teachers and see if you can even make your own newspaper where you explain the gospel to somebody. Okay, I'll see you next week.